Orality and literacy have coexisted for some time, but until the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, oral tradition was the primary means of transmitting ideas orally across time and distance. Western music transformed from an orally based tradition to a highly sophisticated music language transmitted through notation on a written score. While language can be conveyed orally through speech or visually through written form, music cannot be removed from the medium of sound. To a trained musician, a written score can be heard and understood visually without actually having to hear the music played. An example of this is Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, written during the time when he was having near complete hearing loss. The orality and literacy of language and music are so closely tied together, but yet also different in the way that it can be communicated. In this documentary, we'll look at the oral tradition in music and how it transformed into a highly literate form. We'll then look at how oral tradition is being revived through improvisation and how this trend is becoming the secondary orality in music. Music notation is any written system used to visually represent sounds in music. Just like any written language, music notation is a system used to record and preserve music. While music notation can be found as early as 2000 BC, artifacts that are found tend to be fragmented and incomplete. Ancient cultures' use of music notation were not as comprehensive as written language, and therefore many of these fragmented scripts found cannot be deciphered. Those who attempt to study oral tradition or primary orality in music of the past has the same dilemma as with the study of primary orality in languages. As Professor Walter Ong said in his writing Orality and Literacy, you cannot, without serious and distortion, describe a primary phenomenon by starting with a subsequent secondary phenomenon. With this in mind, we'll look at the Roman churches in the Middle Ages and how they shift the liturgical chants from oral transmission to the increasing use of notated liturgical manuscripts. Prior to Gregorian chant, plain chant was developed in the early centuries of Christianity, where it was most likely influenced by the music of Jewish synagogue. Plain chant, also called plain song, is an accompanied sung melody used in liturgies of the Western churches. Most of plain chant began through oral transmission, which utilizes an improvised melody on a set text such as a psalm. Some of these plain chant evolved from the freely improvised melody to a set melody with occasional variations. Through time, spreading of Christianity in the Roman Empire, and various developments of the Christian churches, plain chants began to diversify throughout the expansive regions. The transformation of plain chant to Gregorian chant started with Pope St. Gregory the Great in the 6th century AD. He is credited with unifying the church by organizing these chants from a diverse traditions into uniformity. One of the conditions of the unification was the standardization of chant music through a system of written notation. Although the transformation began in Gregory's time, a system of notation called neumes only appeared in the 9th century. The transition from oral tradition to a notation that is widely accepted can be further broken down into 3 stages. The first stage begins with wavy lines or accent markings on top of the text to indicate the pitch. The second stage is the development of graphs on which the neumes were placed on different height. The third and final stage is the square notation on the 4 staff lines. These notation systems served as mnemonics to help with memory because these melodies would have been learned orally and by ear. With the system becoming more sophisticated and representing more musical ideas, the once purely oral traditions of the past is now supported by the notation text as a guide. Despite the invention of music notation, monks in churches continue to memorize chants. Studies by musicologists and anthropologists have shown that the invention of music notation did not automatically put an end to memorization. Some churches continue this practice of memorizing chant throughout the 17th century. From the moment a boy enters monastery, he spends much of his time singing and memorizing chant music. It has been calculated that all of the different chants added together would consist of about 80 hours of memorized work. In language, Walter Ong described that repetition and formulaic thought patterns were essential for wisdom and effective administration in oral culture. This was especially true for the monastic education in churches, as the monks would memorize chants through repetition and formulaic melodies to help with the memory. Even though the notation system was enthusiastically accepted, the orality and improvisation aspects were not abandoned. As the notation system during the medieval ages was limited to only conveying a few elements of the music, the modern notation system brought a whole new way of composition. Composers can now state the rhythm, dynamics, and many nuances with intricate details. The medieval music period lasted for roughly a millennium. With the invention of the printing press and the widening use of the modern music notation, rapid developments of music followed in the Renaissance, Baroque, Classical, Romantic, Modern, and the current postmodern and contemporary periods. All of these periods took place in just 2/3 of a millennium. Musicians throughout the Renaissance, Baroque, and Classical period developed complexity in their music, but at the same time maintained the orality in their music by employing improvisation in their performances. The music of J.S. Bach does not have written directions for the speed, dynamics, and mood of the written music. Bach would regularly improvise and create variations of his or others' music. Many of the giant figures of the classical music periods were known for their improvisational skills. Beethoven became famous in Vienna as an astounding improviser rather than a composer. During his time, one of the virtuoso Daniel Steibelt came to Vienna to challenge Beethoven through an improvisational contest, believing that he might win. In the competition, Steibelt tossed one of his music score away and improvised on it. After conjuring up a storm on the piano, the crowd was in great applause. When it was Beethoven's turn, he picked up Steibelt's music, put it upside down on the piano, and began to imitate and improvise on Steibelt's playing. Beethoven unraveled his playing, parodied and mocked it, and put it all back together, having looked at it all for the first time upside down. Steibelt, being outplayed and humiliated, left the competition at once and never to set foot in Vienna again. Improvisation was a conventional way of playing music. One of the reasons composers chose to write their music down was because it was only through notation literacy that their music can be preserved. With these music periods behind us, the approach of learning and playing music in the classical music tradition is not the same anymore. Students learn to become literate in music notation so they can reproduce the music of Beethoven and Mozart exactly as it was intended. Improvisation is discouraged. We often hear that improvisation belongs to jazz, while classical music is for those who are serious in learning music. In reality, history tells us that musicians have been improvising music since the beginning. Secondary orality can be found in any music which maintains the oral tradition. Jazz is one of the genres of music which is continuously evolving due to its dichotomy of literacy and orality. Music literacy alone can be viewed as a barrier to creativity. Many view Western classical music and its literate tradition as a preservationist museum piece. If a person is caught copying a piece of literature and presenting it as their own rendition word for word, it would not be accepted. What would Mozart think if we had been performing his music note for note repeatedly for the last few centuries? A printed literature encourages the sense that it is finalized and complete. It is the element of authority which leaves little room for change and dialogue. The same can be said for a piece of music with highly specific instructions and notations on how it is supposed to sound. It is authoritative, and musicians dare not to change it. Expanding on Walter Owen's idea of secondary orality, we can find many examples in today's society. Improvisation in music, YouTube video, and podcast are all examples of secondary orality. From Gregorian Chant to J.S. Bach and to now, orality continues to play a fundamental role in music.